Dragon Age Veilguard. Oh, sorry, Dragon Age the Veilguard, because that really rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? This is the 4th game in the Dragon Age franchise, and one that I have been looking forward to for such a long time. Looking back at all of the games, each one changes pretty drastically from one to the next. Veilguard is no different in this regard. I would even argue it's the most different from the prior games, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Normally, when I think Dragon Age, I think well-written, great characters, witty dialogue, high stakes, political intrigue, and dark fantasy. It's a lot to have in a single series, but it's what makes something like Dragon Age so beloved. It's why it has the fans it has, and why people are so invested in the world of Thedas. You never truly know what's around the corner while every faction is balancing on the edge of a knife. Veilguard, to me, is both a game with a lot of depth in some areas while being light in other areas. There's a lot that I enjoy about this game overall, even while I still feel a bit disappointed with some of the things we didn't end up getting. When I think about a BioWare game, I think about how there's going to be a big emphasis on the story and dialogue. Sure, we get both of those here, but how do they stack up? Well, how about we hop straight into the review? Dragon Age the Veilguard has a lot going for it. The character creator is pretty good overall. It gives you a lot of choices to make your character. Rook, look how you want, even though every character I try to make looks like they haven't eaten in weeks. Look at the depth under that cheekbone. BioWare went above and beyond with the hair physics in Veilguard. So much so, it's honestly the best flowing hair physics I can recall ever seeing in a video game. I can't honestly imagine just how hard that is to pull off, but the devs did it. Kudos to you there. While you continue through the character creator, you'll eventually choose your class to play as. The classes are the classic warrior, rogue, and mage combo. If you're worried about them being too bare bones in combat, they do have 3 specializations each, but we'll get to that later. After choosing your class, you're then shown off the 6 different factions to have your character associated with. This will act as a bit of a backstory for your character, as well as giving you the occasional added dialogue option when it comes to the knowledge your character should possess. I like how this doesn't leave your character as a complete blank slate, and it harkens back to Origin's backstories. Though, while it is similar in nature, Origins is far better with its various backstory choices, and with a variety of them. Still, a nice addition allowing me to better invest in Rook's story. Next up is playstyle. This is essentially your way of choosing how difficult you want the game. Are you interested in only the story with very easy combat? Go with Storyteller. Want to enjoy the combat a bit without it being too hard? Adventurer is your play here. Want to bash your skull against a wall while simultaneously being a masochist at heart? Nightmare. Enough said. After that comes the Finalize tab, where you choose your character's first name, never to be said in game, their voice, and even the pitch of their voice. Not a bad touch there, honestly. But I do want to bring up something here. This is where you can also design your character from the previous game, Dragon Age Inquisition. It shows up on the right of the screen. Don't do what I did and not somehow notice it. I seriously thought it was a summary of my character's backstory or something when I went through this, so don't miss this. And then the summary, and you're off to the races. With the character creator out of the way, let's talk about the combat. The combat in Veilguard is the biggest departure from the rest of the series. Not only is there no tactical pause anymore, but you can't control your allies either. This is an action game. No more planning your strategies from the pause button anymore. The only character you can fight as is your Rook. So whatever class you picked earlier is the only one you're playing as for the duration of the game. Since this is action-based, you have your light attacks, heavy attacks, blocking, parrying, and skills in your arsenal. It all works in a way that feels like BioWare was looking at other games for inspiration like Dark Souls and the newer God of War games and trying to keep things more grounded, but also giving into that power fantasy. My biggest worry about Veilguard was, since we can only play as one class for the entire game, will the fun factor go away? Will fighting enemies feel more like a chore than it is fun? Well, with one playthrough under my belt, I can say right now, I still had fun all the way to the end. 56 hours through, and still enjoyed my time in combat. I'm chalking it up to the various builds you can make, as well as the general chaos of battle. The skill tree is fairly large. It's riddled with nodes that can add more moves and skills to your arsenal, as well as increase certain stats to help you in battle. Every level up gives you points to place throughout the board as you see fit. And if you ever get tired of the build you made, you can always refund the points you spent and use them elsewhere on the board. There's no cost to doing so other than taking the time to do it. Max level is 50, so have at it. Now, while I did state earlier that you can no longer control your companions, you can still give them orders on when to use their skills, who to use them on, as well as what enemies you want them to focus on. Now, I know I said there's no longer a tactical pause button. While using this radial menu does pause the combat, the only way to look around the room is by changing which enemies you're locked onto to issue orders. It's still different from previous games where you could look around the map and plan your strategy. Oh, and another difference here is that you can only take 2 companions with you. Previous games allowed 3 companions to accompany you into battle, so Veilguard feels closer to something like Mass Effect in that regard. At least this time you don't have to worry about your companions falling in combat since they don't have health like you do. Less worrying about them and more about enjoying the combat. Companions also don't level up in the traditional sense. While you yourself will level by gaining experience from things like quests, exploring, and fighting enemies, your companions only get stronger by raising their bond with you. This happens a few ways: their personal quests, dialogue they approve of, and just having them in your party as you travel around. Companion bond maxes out at 10, and they get 2 points for each level. Their skill trees are very easy to work around as they mainly just buff you or are their attacking skills. Now let's talk about what you'll come up against. In a game that has a lot of focus on combat, more than prior games in a lot of instances, not only should the combat be fun and engaging, but the enemy variety should be large enough that you're not seeing the same enemies constantly, right? So while there is variety in the enemy types as per what faction they come from, you will still see and fight the same enemies dozens to hundreds of times in your playthrough. While that can sound bad, there's honestly quite a few enemy types from all of the enemy factions to keep it fun. The Venatori focus on the typical warrior, rogue, mage types as they're more human in nature. Don't actually know since they're all wearing masks. Anyway, as for the Antam, they hail from the Kunari, a race that has a lot of fear of mages for a variety of reasons. Because of this, they take a more warrior and firearms approach to combat. All of this differs from each of the other factions. Essentially, they all have their own personality that fits what we know of the groups. Heck, there's even demons and the Dragon Age stable of Darkspawn that also have their own enemy types. Overall, I ended up enjoying the combat quite a bit. Did it get tedious by the end? Maybe a little, but that's what starting up another playthrough is for. I can choose a different class, or heck, I could just change my build to spice things up a little bit. And pairing enemies always feels good. Your companions also don't have health bars of any sort, so you don't have to worry about keeping them alive at all. The only thing you have to worry about is yourself. This is also a game that pays the more explorer types well. Everywhere you look seems to have something to pick up of some value, be it gold or items. While that's the case for the most part, I will say that the maps the devs made are very different than anything I'm used to. They have this weird layout that's all pathways with a few open areas. They all connect at different spots, and sometimes you'll find shortcuts, but it's not open world zones or anything like that. Even the map can be confusing at times to read. It doesn't help when the minimap keeps turning in the direction you're facing. Seriously, I'd rather they just kept the minimap static with north being up rather than what it is. I had to constantly look at the main map to even understand which way I was facing. That was pretty frustrating. There's plenty of armor and weapons you'll find out in the world. You get these from quests as well as chests. You'll even find gear for your companions as well. They all have their own specific gear, so they don't share the same pool as you. When you find a weapon for yourself, it'll only be a weapon for your class. If you're a mage, you'll never find a rogue weapon, so not to worry there. If you don't like the way you look in different armors, you can use the transmog system. As long as you collect the item in general, it gets placed on the knockout list of items you can change the look to. And you can do this with no cost. I'm glad a lot of games are doing this nowadays. That said, let's move on to the narrative, the thing BioWare is most known for. This is where things get a bit more complicated. I have my own likes and dislikes in this area. I honestly think the overall story that Veilguard sets out to tell is pretty great. From beginning to end, we see Rook's journey with building a team and what they have to do to take down the elven gods themselves. It's a journey of struggle, betrayal, camaraderie, twists, and leadership all wrapped up into one story. It does have some pacing issues at times, but a lot of that can be attributed to being set up for Act 3. Act 3 is absolutely incredibly well done, both in the narrative as well as the set pieces. Speaking of, the set pieces in Veilguard, that being the major story moments, are all incredible. Something I honestly never expected out of a BioWare game prior to this. It might be the focus on it being an action title, as well as the writers trying to keep the story on a set path, rather than how Inquisition had fluff in a lot of it. I personally thought all of the companion quests were well done. Your companions are obviously a major part of the game's narrative. They'll jump into conversations, add in flavor dialogue with each other while you're out exploring, and they all feel different from one another. They all have their different quirks and problems that need working on. Thus, their personal stories that you can do should be top-notch, right? I enjoyed the conclusions we got and the way the story was told. However, that doesn't translate the same when it comes to the dialogue. I don't know what happened here, but some of the dialogue, whether it be quips from your companions, people you're talking to, or even Rook themselves, the dialogue has a more dumbed-down feeling to it than what I've come to expect from BioWare's writers. Now, don't get me wrong, there is some awesome dialogue and moments of choice in Veilguard, but those feel more like outliers than the standard game. With Veilguard, we have the traditional BioWare dialogue wheel, and that comes with the downsides of that system from previous games. We're still given very basic wording on what to expect Rook will say from what we choose, and it's sometimes very different from what we actually hear them say.
I'm gonna have to side with the Lords of Fortune's resident dragon expert.
While I'm personally used to this system from BioWare, I know it's still a system with problems. I'm a firm believer that if they got rid of the wheel and put in what Rook will say word for each option, it would help people to choose what they want to say and how they play Rook. The dialogue wheel has always had this weird disconnect that I can only hope that BioWare does away with in the future someday. This is Rook's story. That means that there's only one direction that dialogue ends up going, no matter the option chosen. Granted, there are some decisions that'll be different and will have different outcomes, but those don't dictate everything. It's more flavoring on top of everything else. Even though it's Rook's story rather than ours, it's a story I enjoyed from beginning to end. Rather than treating it like a choose-your-own-adventure book, treat it like a normal book where you're along for the ride. BioWare stated that there aren't any current plans for DLC, and I honestly don't know how they could do it anyway with how the game ends. But I'm not going to go into any further detail, as this is supposed to be spoiler-free. With all that said, this is the main rundown of Dragon Age: The Veilguard. The gameplay is fun, engaging, and chaotic, while the story is understandable front to back, while also being lore-heavy and pretty well written. And while I understand that the art style they decided to go with here isn't for everyone, it was definitely a very gorgeous game. I loved the beginning of the game. Seeing Minrathous at night was beautiful and had so much personality to it. I could honestly take a much larger Minrathous map in the future and love that. The overall experience of the game is really good, though it does feel smaller in scope than Inquisition, but I'm a firm believer that a game doesn't need to raise its scope all the time. If they did, we'd probably have another ballooned budget that nobody can handle properly. While this wasn't the game I expected to receive, especially after how well Baldur's Gate 3 went over, this was still a very solid experience that I was glad to put almost 60 hours into. I know that the development of Veilguard had its issues, such as starting over a couple of times, so to see what we got here as a solid game from beginning to end sounds like a miracle, but I do hope that BioWare can start and stick with a vision for the next Dragon Age game from pre-production until launch. Games that restart development are notorious for ending up underbaked and lacking in fun and engagement. Even though the devs were able to pull this off, it's not a great habit to keep. Here's to hoping that things work out smoother for them in the future. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you liked the video and hope you all have a great rest of your day. Adios.